January 27th. This is a Russian map of today showing the last big offensive of the Red Army towards the Oder River that started at the beginning of January 1945. I mean, by that time, the Soviet Red Army had been fighting the Nazis for 3.5 years. And they started just east of Krakow, but on the 27th of January, they basically passed through the town of Oswiecim, or Auschwitz, or as it was also known. Now, if you're looking at this map, you see that that most of the activity was actually north of Auschwitz. This was an incredibly big offensive, and keep that in mind as we start talking about what was happening in Oswiecim. So a week before, some 65,000 inmates of the Auschwitz concentration camp were pushed on the road on a death march towards the west, here in the drawing by David Olaire, of which we have a reproduction in the exhibition. And then when on the 27th of January, the Red Army reached the gates of Auschwitz, there were only some 8,000 prisoners left in all of the 3 camps that they liberated that day: Auschwitz I, the Stammlager, Auschwitz II, or Auschwitz-Birkenau, and Auschwitz-Monowitz, mostly sick prisoners. And this is then a drawing made by one of the Soviet liberators, Tolkachev, of basically his interpretation, what he saw. It was an unbearable kind of tragedy that he witnessed. The next day, on January 28th, already the New York Times gave a very short account of the liberation of this camp, noting particularly that 1.5 million persons had been murdered there, or it's said to be murdered there, in a longer article about the Red Army's push to the west. It wasn't at that time seen as important enough to basically to give it a separate heading. It was just part of the war story. And indeed, when the Soviet soldiers arrived in the camp, of course, what they saw, what they heard, was deeply troubling, was very upsetting to them. And they really did their best. I mean, the help that the physicians and the medics and all the soldiers of the Ukrainian front, which was the particular division that liberated Auschwitz, was absolutely amazing in those days. But in general, all the attention of the world was focused on what was happening in the Crimea, in Yalta, where there was a very important conference between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, which was really about organizing the post-war order, or as some people would say, dividing spheres of influence. That was where all the journalists were. So as the Soviets start a forensic investigation, interviewing survivors and so on, start basically trying to make sense of the big bare bags of hair that they find there, and 70,000 suits and all the glasses and so on. And as they start digging up accounts by Sonderkommandos, Jewish workers who had been forced to work in the crematoria and who had left an account of what was happening there before they were murdered. And as they started to now create the official movie of the liberation, the movie that is normally shown, is actually a reconstruction made a month later at the end of February. And here we have a view of one of the scenes that is being shot, of the opening of the gates. So even this very famous scene of children, surviving children dressed in oversized grown-up concentration camp uniforms, which they would never have worn while they were in the camp, walking between barbed wire fences, all set basically in scene for the Soviet film unit who was filming them. This is not from the liberation itself. But at the same time, it continues the advance of the Soviets here in the city of Breslau. around 200 miles to the west, on their way to Berlin. And that what was making the news. That was what basically the world wanted to know about. And then in the middle of April 1945, the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. And this is for the first time a liberation of a concentration camp where enormous amount of photographers and journalists are invited by the British to basically to come and have a look at what such a camp is like. So there's much more evidence, and there's much more visual evidence about the liberation of Belsen than of Auschwitz. The Soviet committee that had been at work since the 27th of January, forensic investigation in Auschwitz, finally issues its report on at the beginning of May 1945. So here we have the committee in their office in Auschwitz. You see at the back of them, you see an architectural plan of the camp. But of course, in the beginning of May, the whole world is celebrating the end of the war in Europe. Here we have a scene in London, and here we have the very famous parade in Moscow, the victory parade, where the soldiers of the Red Army have all of the German flags, which are then basically thrown into the mud. And so again, in some way, the forensic report that talks about 5 million dead in Auschwitz, and an inflated figure. Today, the number is considered to be closer to 1.1 million dead. But again, in some way, this report was published at the wrong moment, when the world had another interest. So the 27th of January really wasn't that important in 1945 for anyone but the people who were in Auschwitz at that day, the 8,000 survivors and the soldiers who were there, and also in the decades that followed. It wasn't commemorated at all. The only people who ever would gather on the 27th of January would be members of local chapters of the International Auschwitz Committee. However, the International Auschwitz Committee wasn't that popular. Many Auschwitz survivors were even not members of it, and certainly not many Holocaust survivors, because it was seen as a kind of communist front organization. So it was not a day that was considered important. In Poland itself, when people were thinking of the dead in the Second World War, and of course the Auschwitz camp became part of the Polish state after the war. It was the museum, the Auschwitz Museum, created in 1947, was a Polish state institution, but the day of the commemoration of the dead in Poland was actually All Souls Day. It's a Catholic day of commemoration, and it continues to be like that. Even up to today, so Poland at the end of October celebrates in some way the commemoration of the death of the Second World War, which then also basically for most Poles are the non-Jewish Polish victims of Auschwitz. So then, when we deal with the memory of the Jewish victims of Auschwitz, the question is, okay, what day was appropriate? And there was really no day to do that. So for the first time that the Holocaust gets its own day in Europe is in 1978, when in Germany the decision is taken to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the Kristallnacht, or the Reichspogromsnight, in November 9th, 1938. Here we have stamps that are issued that day of synagogues that were destroyed. And and here we have of the Jewish Telegraphic Agency a report of November 13, where it basically says that the anniversary was observed solemnly by trade unions and youth organizations whose members placed wreath on the graves of Nazi victims in Frankfurt, Munich, Dortmund, Essen, Cologne, and other cities. Some used the occasion to sound warnings against increasing Nazi-like tendencies in West Germany. The most important event took place in Cologne, and actually I was that night in Cologne itself, as a student, but was unable to get in the synagogue where this commemoration took place. This is the then only surviving synagogue in Cologne, which is undergoing a restoration right now. And there, the president of the Federal Republic, Scheel, and the Chancellor, Schmidt, both attended the meeting, and for the first time, basically as official representatives of the German state, and by implication also the German nation, took responsibility for what had happened in 1938 and afterwards. It was a very important occasion for the kind of the turn of Germans towards starting to realize that the Holocaust wasn't a closed chapter. And of course, it is this time also that the American television series Holocaust is going to be shown in Germany. But the 27th of January only comes to the forefront in 1995. So here we have a picture at the gate of Auschwitz, Arbeit macht frei. At the center, we see Lech Walesa, the president of Poland, who had decided to make 27th of January 1995 a kind of coming out party or coming out occasion for Poland. Poland was now a well-established democracy after 6 years since the Berlin Wall had fallen, or basically 5 at that time. And he decided that it would be important to have a commemoration where he would invite foreign dignitaries. And of course, you see right next to him, Elie Wiesel. Now, one of the dignitaries who attended is the man who's standing under my kind of crude arrow. And this was the president of Germany, Roman Herzog. And Roman Herzog was very moved by this first official international commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz. And so a few months later, on the 8th of May, 1995, he presided in Berlin over the 50th anniversary of the basically end of the Second World War. There was this big gala session in the concert house in Berlin, and he spoke there. And President Mitterrand was there, Al Gore was there, Vice President of the United States, basically a who's who of international personalities. And Roman Herzog, who had just been in Auschwitz, was very alarmed about the fact that many people in Germany believed that the 50th anniversary was not an anniversary of a good new beginning, anniversary of a liberation of Germany and Europe from Nazism, but it was basically the beginning of the decline of Germany. That right-wing figures had been talking about a moment of shame and catastrophe in May 1945. And so people also were talking in Germany that not only, of course, Jews were victims and European resistance fighters and Roma Sinti were victims, but also they were saying that, for example, German soldiers had been victims, or old men and young boys who in 1945 had been drafted into the Volkssturm. They were all victims. And Roman Herzog found it very important to basically push against that idea. So he decided that, having just been in Auschwitz on the 27th of January, that the 27th of January would become an official day of commemorating the victims of National Socialism. We say very clearly, never again. Of course, this poster is later because it shows the Berlin Holocaust Memorial, which was only completed 10 years later. And so in the German, the first time that a state, that a country adopts the 27th of January as an official holiday is actually Germany, as a way to push against neo-Nazi and neo-Nazi kind of activity. Then 2-3 years later, the man in the left of the picture starts to think about the rise of neo-Nazism and right-wing extremism in Denmark. His name is Göran Persson. He is the prime minister. And there is also denial in Denmark. This is still a very good period for denial. And he asks Yehuda Bauer, the chief historian of Yad Vashem, for suggestions of how to counter it. And both of them decide that it would be a good time at the beginning of the new millennium, that is in January 2000 to begin the new millennium with a very clear international statement, a gathering of heads of state and heads of government in Stockholm with scholars and activists and to basically say this new millennium needs to start on a different foot than the 19th century, the last century had done. And so they decide that in January 2000, that they will have in Sweden, they will have a very large conference, and also these heads of state will be there. So actually things can be decided that will make a difference. And here we see many of them, Persson and Schröder, the Chancellor Schröder to the right, and of course Elie Wiesel to the left, and the Dutch Prime Minister behind Persson, and so on. It's a very high-powered community. And in order to basically anchor the meeting, Persson decides that the 27th of January will be part of the meeting, so they have a reason to have an official commemoration. So it just happened to be that Auschwitz was on the 27th of January. It was a very good date to basically organize the conference around it. So this is also the conference in which the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance is created. So what happens is that Sweden decides the 27th of January to become then a day of official commemoration of the Holocaust. Then England, just before this meeting, Tony Blair decides to join. Then France joins, and before you know it, many leading European countries have basically established the 27th of January as a day of Holocaust commemoration. Move forward a few years to around 2002, 2003. And what's happening is that the European Union is looking to expand. And of course, this is an expansion towards the east, which, as we all know, is also today part of the reasons that Russia is quite unhappy. And a number of East European and East Central European countries were going to join the EU that had a rather spotty record in the history of the Holocaust, or at least that was seen like that, especially Hungary, but also Slovakia. Then there were issues with Poland, etc., Lithuania, of course. And so there was a real concern about the baggage these countries were taking with them. This was the time that Jan Gross, the Polish-American historian, published his book about Neighbors, the destruction of the Jewish community in Yad Wapne, which was basically about the role of Polish civilians, not of Germans, in the murder of their neighbors and the destruction of their synagogue and so on. So the question was how to deal with that. And so the leadership of the European Union decided that the European Parliament should propose and decide to adopt a general day of commemoration of the Holocaust on the January 27th. And the reason was that the January 27th was already a day of commemoration in some European countries at the time as a result of the Stockholm Conference. And so in some way, they adopted this statement on Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and racism, established the 27th of January as a day that was going to be focused at, and Holocaust Memorial Day. And the important thing was that every country that was going to join had to adopt this day as an official day of commemoration. This, in some ways, Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, if you want to be members, you have to accept this. You cannot become a member without this political kind of decision on your side. At the same time, already Aleida Assmann, who is a very important German historian, who specializes in memory culture, had already coined a phrase that Auschwitz was the foundation of European Union, a unity. That is, that the memory of Auschwitz is in some way the only thing that all of the European nations have in common. A negative foundation in a sense, but a very strong one. And this is also one which, for example, Chancellor Merkel has talked about a lot. So Auschwitz became an anchor within the European Union, and it was following the example of the European Union that Kofi Annan then decided a year later that also the United Nations was going to adopt January 27th as a day of commemoration, except, of course, that different from the European Union, the adoption of that day in members of the United Nations was not going to be a condition of membership. But here we have then the first commemoration in 2006 in New York City in the plenary hall of the United Nations. Now, when in 2000 all of the dignitaries were in Stockholm, there was something that didn't really work that well out. There was a big meeting in the Royal Palace. There was a big meeting in the meeting halls, but a meeting of commemoration. But there was also a separate meeting in the synagogue, which I actually attended. And it was interesting that the meeting in the synagogue on the January the 27th was not really coordinated with that of all the heads of state. So there were almost like two different commemorations. And so this brings us then to actually another date, the 27th of Nisan, which is a day that, depending on the year, occurs somewhere in mostly in the months of April, sometimes in May, which is the Jewish Day of commemoration, which goes back to the early 1950s, established by Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. And this is a day that that is anchored in the memory of the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And so right now we basically have in the world two Holocaust commemoration days. We have the 27th of January, which is rooted in the politics of European unification, and we have Yom Hashoah, which is located basically in a Jewish reading of history, but also a somewhat Zionist reading, because it typically also falls halfway between the beginning of Passover and the day of the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. And so here we have then an image of Yom HaShoah in Jerusalem in the sanctuary of Yad Vashem. So what's interesting that in North America, and I show here, of course, my Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada, that in North America, in general, the Jewish communities were able to convince civilian authorities to take the Yom HaShoah as the kind of more important of the 2 days. So here we have a commemoration in Toronto, organized by the Canadian Society of Yad Vashem, and then here in Temple Emmanuel in New York. So the North American experience with the 27th of January is somewhat different, because there was already a well-established tradition of actually commemorating Yom HaShoah in April. And so I think that it's kind of important that we place today's date in relationship to Yom HaShoah. Don't forget about Yom HaShoah. Yes, today is in memory of the 6 million Jews, but it's also a day that has been charged politically with the task of also fighting against racism, anti-Semitism, and so on. That is much less the case in Yom HaShoah.